Now here's a fancy little gem that I honestly think should get a little more attention. For the PlayStation 3 and PC, it's the flashy 2D fighting game known as Untitled Chapter. I actually got introduced to this one not too long ago while I was still attending Temple University. Every Friday night, a group of fighting game enthusiasts would come into the gaming center and plug in some fighting games, and there was one in particular that caught my eye that looked like BlazBlue, but it wasn't. As it turns out, this game was called Untitled Chapter, developed by Ecole Software and... French Bread? Okay. And French Bread was also apparently responsible for Melty Blood, a similar 2D fighting game for the PlayStation 2 that I might check out one of these days. So I sat down and gave this game a whirl, and while I did have a lot of trouble at first because the mechanics, quite frankly, are a little tough to get used to, this game is actually a lot of fun, and once you pick it up, it's a blast. Untitled Chapter is a 4-button fighter very similar to BlazBlue and Guilty Gear, but in my opinion, it's a little more satisfying, mainly due to the speed and animation of the game itself. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still get plenty of enjoyment out of BlazBlue, and as for Guilty Gear, well, maybe it's just a me thing, but that game's a little too slow for my taste. Like most 4-button fighters, Untitled Chapter utilizes a light, medium, heavy, and special buttons, and you use these buttons to perform combos, do special moves, and so on and so forth, you know, standard fighting game stuff. Unique to this game, however, is this little meter at the bottom of the screen that, to this day, I still don't know the proper name of, but I'm just gonna go ahead and call it the Void Meter. This right here is the mechanic that kinda gave me trouble at first because the Void Meter increases and decreases based on the positioning of the fighters and where they're moving. This means you have to have a pretty good balance of when to go in or back off during the neutral game and when you're attacking, because this Void Meter is actually extremely important because it's what you use in order to enter Awakening mode. Get too careless or play too passively during the neutral game, and that meter has the potential to break, which means that you'll pretty much be at a disadvantage for the rest of the round. Once you get used to that unique little mechanic, however, it's pretty much just a matter of practice and determination. Aside from a few elements here and there, this game's a pretty standard fighter, and a fun one at that. Now let's take a look at the characters. Untitled Chapter has a pretty standard-sized roster of characters, and I gotta give the developers credit for creativity here because a lot of these characters are pretty freaking cool. When I first played the game, I immediately took a shine to Akatsuki for being the standard Shoto of the game, and Nanase for, well, wind powers. It's also nice to see a roster of characters in a Japanese fighting game that for the most part look very human, besides the obvious characters like Waldstein or Merkaba. And that's another thing I want to address, but I'm probably not going to spend too much time on, is the story of the game. Simply put, several regions of Japan are being set upon by the enigmatic Hollow Knight, voids start attacking innocent people, and those who survive become inverts, which pretty much makes up the roster of the game. Overall, this game's narrative is nothing to write home about, which I guess is to be expected in a 2D fighter, but if you can believe it, this game's narrative is a lot more simple and not as unbelievably convoluted like BlazBlue or Guilty Gear's storyline. Which, in my opinion, makes this game a lot easier to get into, and overall, it's a breath of fresh air. It also makes the characters of this game a lot more endearing if you ask me. Instead of being these all-powerful beings or trained warriors that have gone through the hardships of battle for most of their lives, these guys are just victims of circumstance that have the fortitude to make the best of their bad situations. Then there are the little details about this game that only make it better. The art style and animation is pretty top-notch, and it sports a pretty kick-ass soundtrack, Blood Drain and Skyscraper being a couple of my favorite tracks. It only makes me wish that this game was more popular because overall, it's a really balanced fighting game. I see a couple of tournaments here and there, but this game doesn't even have a position at EVO, which I think is wasted potential. But hey, this game is supposedly slated to get a sequel, so maybe that'll change sometime in the near future. If there was one complaint I did have about Untitled Chapter, it's that it does suffer from a slight issue in its character balance. By that I mean that there are a couple of characters that are complete outliers from an otherwise balanced roster. Whether it's the underpowered underdogs like Akatsuki, or the characters that seem borderline broken compared to the rest of the cast. I'm looking at you, Hilda. But hey, maybe that's just a me problem since I'm not actually a pro fighting gamer. So coming from a casual fighting gamer who has a rather intermediate level of skill, Untitled Chapter, I'd say, is definitely worth a shot.